Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Ask Andrew, where you submit questions about movies and I do my best to answer them. If you have a question about movies that has been on your mind as of late, or even from years past, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and submit the question via the Ask Andrew form. I look forward to getting some more questions and answering them in the coming weeks. Today's first question comes from Dick. He asks, when The Night of the Hunter came out, a United Artists executive said it was, quote, too artsy. The critics did not like it, and neither did the audiences. Granted, it wasn't publicized well. Only later did it become a, quote, great movie. Maybe the initial response was the right one. Can a movie be great if the average moviegoer doesn't like it? Well, this is a really interesting question and one that comes up a lot. Question of audience taste versus critic taste versus industry taste, and what is a marker of quality, and is there any objective standard for it, and do you have to enjoy or like a movie, think it's fun and entertaining for it to be a good movie? Is any movie that many people don't appreciate, can that possibly be a truly good movie? These questions come up all the time, and they're sort of unanswerable in some sense. This movie comes up because our film for discussion this week is The Night of the Hunter, the 1955 movie directed by famed actor Charles Laughton and starring Robert Mitchum and Shelley Winters, among others. And it is, to, I think, put it fairly, a divisive film. And the movie is now widely hailed as a classic. Critics, historians, people in the industry love it. It's been significantly influential on a number of filmmakers of subsequent generations, but it does not sit well with every member of the contemporary audience, actually I should say of the current audience, or nor did it with the contemporary audience back in 1955 and critics as well from that period. So what's changed? Well, styles change, sensibilities change, the standards of realism change, our view of the necessity of a film appearing to be realistic changes, and what people want or expect from movies certainly change. But to get to the specific question that Dick is asking, can a movie be great if the average moviegoer doesn't like it? The short answer to this question is yes. I think in part it depends on how you define the average moviegoer, but I would submit to you that several movies that are today, if not universally, then nearly universally viewed as truly outstanding films, were not enjoyed or appreciated by audiences when they came out, and in fact are not enjoyed or appreciated by many people I think we'd consider the average moviegoer today. Two examples come easily to mind. Citizen Kane and Vertigo, the two movies that sort of go back and forth for the 1 and 2 slots of the greatest American movies of all time. I don't have the time here to really go into why those movies are great. I think that we can at least agree that by and large that they are exceptional films is agreed upon. But those are movies that at the time were not very popular with audiences at all, and frankly aren't movies that are, I don't think, considered to be very entertaining or enjoyable by the average moviegoer today. So I think those two films alone prove that yes, a movie can be great if the average moviegoer doesn't like it. I think once we get into a question like this, we need to sort of define some terms and some standards and try and find common ground that way. But the short answer to your question, and I think the definitive answer, is yes, a movie can be great if the average moviegoer doesn't like it. Our next question comes from Jason, who asks, when people talk about old Hollywood, what do they mean when they say the studio system? Well, these are good questions. The studio system refers to a particular manner of business and industrial style and structure that was in place in the American film industry from, depending on who you ask, roughly 1927 to 1960. Some people would say from 1927 all the way until 1968. The studio, of course, in studio system refers to the major studios that were instrumental in the formation of Hollywood as it has been known for almost a century. And those studios are all companies whose names you recognize: Warner Brothers, Columbia, Universal, and others, Paramount, and some others that have come and gone to an extent recently. 20th Century Fox and Sony, of course, bought Columbia, which had been around from that period as well. RKO was one that was around and went away decades ago. But you know these companies, you know these names, and they all worked together basically to establish and promulgate a very sort of rigid industrial system. But it's a rigid industrial system that allowed for, or some would say led to, tremendous creativity in the creation of the hundreds of movies that came out during those years that people still enjoy to this day, many of which are considered indelible classics. This was a system that was very much a system and factory-like, and close to as much of an assembly line as one could be, with each product being different to some degree and involving individual artisans. But that's sort of the thing is, most of these people certainly weren't treated as artists or even artisans, and many of them didn't think of themselves that way either. You were given a role and a job, and you were given a contract that was not based on each project, but based on time, a weekly salary over a course of a certain number of years to do your task, your area of specialty. If you were a writer, you wrote; an actor, you acted; a director, you directed; a cinematographer, you shot the films. If you were a lighting technician, you worked with the lights; costumes, you made costumes, so on and so forth. And only with very rare exceptions was there any movement between those categories. Some writers became directors as well. Preston Sturges, Billy Wilder, John Huston come to mind, but there really are enough to name that shows you how small of a sort of sample it was. Most people remained in the areas where they sort of, landed. You could rise in certain regards. You didn't, I shouldn't say nobody, very few people came and started out as a director. They had other jobs, but it wasn't like they transitioned from being a cinematographer to a director, or, with the exceptions of those people I mentioned, a writer to a director, or an actor to a director, though there were a couple of those. Ida Lupino comes to mind. So it was a very rigid industrial system. And the reason that it is said to have lasted from 1927 to 1968 in the broadest sense is 1927 was, of course, the emergence of synchronized sound, dialogue, and effects, and made possible musicals and romantic comedies with a lot of sparkling dialogue and on and on. And that sort of standardized the way the industry did its work, and the departments that were needed and the technicians that were involved for the next few decades. There were changes, obviously, with Technicolor and widescreen formats and other types of color, but by and large, they knew who they needed and what they needed to do and what departments they had to have, and they were off and running for the next few decades. The reason that 1968 is often put at the end date is in the fall of that year, the rating system was first implemented, something resembling the rating system we currently have for American movies today. And the reason that is seen as the end of the studio system is that it marked a significant change in the industry's approach to filmmaking and what film should be. While this started really at the dawn of the 1960s, and that's why some people end the period in 1960. Um, the industry from 1934, pretty strongly for the next 2 decades, had a self-censorship regime called the Production Code, and that really regulated the content and morality and other sort of quote-unquote good and evil aspects of movies very firmly for those 2 decades, and then for a variety of reasons, including the increased exhibition of foreign films and the emergence of television and some industrial policy changes as well. Then the movies had to sort of change their approach and become more risque in order to compete in and with the rest of culture. They began to update and revise and loosen those restrictions. But at least on paper and at least in theory, until the rating system in 1968, the movie industry tended to think and say that every movie they made should be at least acceptable to all audiences. And they weren't willing to sort of cede any potential audience based on the content or the nature of the film. That changed with the rating system. The rating system was an open, plain acknowledgement that, for example, an R-rated film is not appropriate for people under the age of 17 unless their parents explicitly give them permission. An X-rated film, which was not thought of when it was implemented in 1968 the way it is today, was thought to be not appropriate for anyone under 17 under any circumstances. And so by adding that nomenclature to a movie, the industry was acknowledging that not all movies are for all people, and we are segmenting our audience. And that's one of the reasons why it is thought that that is the end time of the sort of studio system. There's a lot more to it. It's a very interesting topic, and I could have gone on for many, many more minutes, and perhaps there will be some follow-up questions. But for now, I hope that gives a good sense of what people meant or mean when they say the studio system. Thanks for the question. For our final question today, we hear from Aaron, who asks, should horror movies be considered serious films? What's the attraction? Well, this is an interesting question, and I'm not sure the two parts of the bigger question necessarily go together. Should they be considered serious films? Yes. And they have the same potential to be a serious, worthwhile, respectable cinematic endeavor as do movies belonging to any other genre. But the question of what's the attraction, I think, is in a way separate from that. The attraction is the same sort of attraction that attracts people to other genre movies. People like the way the stories are put together. They like the way certain moments in the film make them feel. People who like melodrama love sentiment and emotion and perhaps like a good cry. People who like action movies like the catharsis of on-screen violence. People who like adventure movies like the excitement of sort of rare and hard to imagine thrills. People who like comedies like to laugh. And people who like horror films like to be scared. And they like the ratcheted up suspense bordering on terror that, or sometimes moving fully into terror, that horror movies, at least well-made horror movies, can provide. So I think that in some regards, the question of attraction isn't so critical. We all kind of know what horror movies offer on that front, and for that reason, some of us, including myself, rarely watch them because we don't enjoy being scared. In terms of the attraction of them as a sort of serious film genre, or a genre in which a serious film, through which a serious film can be made, I think the attraction is obviously that, you know, so much of politics and culture and debate and the artistic and intellectual exploration of a society has to do with what the culture is afraid of. Maybe not afraid of in the sense that they're afraid of, Linda Blair in The Exorcist or Jack Nicholson in The Shining, but deeply concerned about, and maybe in ways that are unconscious or subconscious, or in ways they don't fully understand or can't fully articulate. Seems to me that while not uniquely suited among genres for exploring things in that way, horror certainly has a tremendous potential to. I think only of a film, Get Out, that went to really interesting places in its exploration of the issues of race and how black people and white people view certain things differently, and the hopes and fears about some relatively recent developments in racial discourse in our country. And so I think that movie alone demonstrates that the genre can and should be at certain times taken seriously. That being said, are there plenty of horror movies that are made just for cheap thrills? Absolutely. But there are plenty of every genre that are made just for cheap thrills, right? I mean, there are plenty of comedies that are utterly silly and devoid of any satirical or, thoughtful content, and just, have lots of, people getting hit in the face with pies or hit in other places with other things that are meant simply to make you laugh. A lot of melodramas aren't really about complicated relationships or any important social issues. They're just about the emotional catharsis of a good cry or a tragedy or what have you, and on and on. I think that most film aficionados or fans, and certainly scholars and historians, could probably name at least one very substantive, serious movie in each genre. So for that matter, I think that there's a case to be made, and a strong one, that horror movies have as much potential as any other genre to be serious, and should be taken seriously in the same regard or at the same rate as films of other genres. I will say, though, that I think that given the demographics of the demographics of the audience, which tends to be younger people for horror films, I think a lot of times there's not a tremendous effort to imbue them with any great meaning. I think given the fact that they tend to be one of the less expensive genres to produce, and tend to not be one where the sort of production values are necessarily the first thing to be considered, that when movies are made quickly or cheaply, inexpensively, I should say, a lot of times that doesn't necessarily lend itself, that process doesn't lend itself to having the movie be tremendously thoughtful. That being said, there are plenty of very inexpensive movies that are tremendously thoughtful, and that were sort of, thought of to be quote unquote B movies, but end up being far more profound and lasting than anyone thought at the time. So horror, I think, has the same potential as any other genre. It may not make the most of its potential with the same sort of consistency as some other genres in the here and now in the present industry, but I do think that it should be taken seriously, and that any genre, because of its nature, the nature of genre and what that really means if you think about it, has potential and should be taken seriously, and that extends to horror. Thanks a lot for the question. And thanks for tuning in to this episode of Ask Andrew. I do hope to continue to get questions from you all. You can visit the Film Studies Online page on Bryn Mawr Film Institute website, brynmawrfilm.org, and submit a question via the Ask Andrew form. You will also be reminded of the opportunity to ask Andrew questions in our weekly email, so please consider signing up for those. They have a lot of great information and fun movie activities and screening recommendations, a whole bunch of stuff. So please consider signing up for those. Please visit brynmarfilm.org, and please consider supporting Bryn Mawr Film Institute while we are temporarily closed, and bringing lots of programming to you via our website and videos like this one. Thanks very much.